Our next presentation is by Dr. Leslie Bush. Dr. Bush is a paleoethnobotanist who got her PhD from Indiana University in 2001. She has a consulting practice in macrobotanical analysis. She's currently involved with investigations associated with road improvements in Anderson and Hidalgo counties, in the Boydart Creek Reservoir, and the Iowa office of the state archaeologist. And she's also the lead instructor for the April 2021 Archaeobotany Academy. So, Dr. Bush, are you there?
I am here. I am going to go ahead and share my screen if I can.
Okay, let me stop mine.
Okay.
There you go.
All right. Well, hi. It is great to be here. I'm about a 15-year member of NIPSOT, and as you could tell from Bill's introduction, an archaeologist by trade. My work usually involves looking at tiny plant parts under the microscope, parts from archaeological sites, to understand the foodways of the ancestors of modern Texas tribes like the Apache and the Caddo and the Tonkawa, on whose ancestral lands I am sitting. One of the things that I do to better understand ancient foods is to cook and eat them. The recipes that I'm offering today are simple things that you can make with the modern equivalents of a campfire, pots, and a mortar and pestle. But I want to be clear that there are many modern descendants who continue to recreate traditional dishes, and many also who practice a much more elaborate and sophisticated cuisine based on native ingredients, and those are all accessible through books and YouTubes, and you can go to the restaurants. So I will start with the recipes that I have experience with, starting with the spring by honoring the spring edible greens that have come back so vigorously after our recent weather crisis. The violet on the far right center is a photo I took on February 23rd, so just about a week after our temperature first got back above freezing here in the Austin area. And a beautiful recipe for these spring edibles is this simple wild spring paste that I got from my herbalism teacher, Ginger Webb, in her class. That 8 ounces of greens to 2 ounces of salt in a mortar and pestle or in a blender. The 2 ounces of salt is meant to keep the paste stable in the refrigerator for months, and the serving size is meant to be small. When I make it, I like a little bigger serving size and a little less salt. So I use a 1/2 to 1 ounce of salt, keep it in the fridge, and make sure to use it in about a week. There are recipes for spring pesto you can find on the web that are more clearly based on Italian basil pesto, and they call for nuts and oil, and which is also delicious and can be native if you choose the right kinds of seeds and oils. There are so many greens that work well in this recipe. It all depends on availability and on your taste. Mine used a lot of violets because that's what I had, and some bedstraw, but not a lot. It didn't seem to be too hairy, though. I was surprised by that. And diversity is really the strength in these recipes, though. Just a little bit of greens from whatever plants you can get in the spring. For instance, oxalic acid could be a problem if you used almost all wood sorrels or almost all Chenopodium, goosefoot, or just vetches or peas might cause some flatulence. And spiderwort stems can be watery and kind of make your paste not very nice. So a diverse mix is a healthy mix, and there are also a lot of non-natives that you can use in this spring pesto if you want to eat your weeds. Chickweed, I have made, I think here, this slide. This is a mostly chickweed pesto, and I was really surprised that was not stringy, because as you're pulling those weeds, they sometimes feel like they're really thin and stringy and have those thin stringy roots, but they made up into a beautiful pesto. And I think after Craig Hensley's talk this morning, we need to add watercress as one of the plants that I'm excited now to try in this early spring paste. And culinary herbs are also really lovely in this if you have those around. The best strategy for harvesting these greens is really to harvest in a way that you don't need to wash the plants afterwards. cutting with the scissors just above the dirt line, and cutting from areas that you know are clean. But if it's rained recently, or if you want to pull unwanted plants, you're going to eat your weeds from the roots. So you can harvest and wash, just make sure that you let the greens dry before you grind them so you don't end up with kind of a watery mess. One spring green that you should not eat raw in this paste is of course pokeweed. I hope everybody's been warned about that. It is a wonderful pot herb if you get it young enough. The plant in the center of the picture has those flowers and the developing fruits, and it's kind of gotten stemmy and started to branch. That is too old. You want something more like the picture in the bottom right. Collect the leaves when it's young, before they've started to branch, definitely before they have the flower stalks. Boil the water, change the water, boil the leaves in the water, change the water, boil them again. Some sources recommend boiling for a third time, but I find there's just not much leaf left if you boil for a third time. I think maybe if you're not sure that you got the leaves young enough, then you might want to go ahead and do that. But it makes just this beautiful, I find it almost effervescent, spring greens that I eat straight up. Other people like to cook them with onions and maybe bacon. And these leaves, like poke and the greens for wild spring paste, are abundant on the landscape in the early and mid-spring, but there aren't many calories in them. So for people living on the land, spring is when the resources that are stored from the abundance of fall become critically important, which is why I'm putting pecan nuts here in our spring foods, because it's especially important for these foods with a lot of fat that translate into much needed calories for the spring season. And my recipe here for nut soup is inspired by the Cherokee tradition of hickory nut soup. It's called kanuchi in the Cherokee language. There aren't many pecans that grow in the traditional Cherokee homeland out at the eastern end of the Trail of Tears, but they're readily available here in Texas, and so that's what I use. And the first step in making pecan kanuchi is to find yourself a NIPSOT member who grows pecans if you don't have access to your own pecan tree. And I've known Dennis and his wife Marilyn for many years through their membership in the Georgetown NIPSOT group. And he sold me a couple of bags of pecans. And what you do is to take each individual nut, give it one whack in the mortar and pestle. These were pre-cracked, so it was pretty easy. Take off the outer shell, remove the inner septum, but you don't have to worry about the little pieces of nutshell that cling between the lobes. It's about getting the calories from the nuts, not necessarily getting every part of the nut meat. So we're looking to extract the oil later in boiling water. So we've extracted, we've gotten rid of most of the shells, but we're not worrying about the little bits. And then at that point, the nut meats and whatever remains of the shells are ground up in the mortar and pestle. You could probably do this in a blender. I have not tried. And at this point, you can add in dried fruits, herbs, jerky, ground turkey jerky, or even cornmeal if you like that for the flavor and the texture. And traditionally, the soup balls are more 3 or 4 inch balls for making a whole pot of soup. I shape them into 1 or 2 inch balls because mine is a desktop version to have for lunch at work in a mug at my desk. So, and traditionally they're boiled on the stove, often with rice, boiled down until the soup is there's a thick broth, and then you strain it to get rid of the small shells. Is how you're getting rid of the last of those nut shells. And my small kanuchi ball goes into a coffee mug at work, and I steep it in boiling water for about water that's been brought to a hard boil for about 10 minutes. And I don't strain it. I just swish it, maybe use a spoon to get the near floatables, and then discard the dregs. And that's really important so that I don't end up with the nutshell in my kanuchi. I like mine personally with cranberries for the tang, and then corn nuts for the salty and smoky taste that adds. So summertime is the time to eat the raw fruits that can be had with just a little preparation. But I should say, just because they're abundant and available doesn't mean we should eat them all. Ethical harvest guidelines call for maybe harvesting about at most 10% of a stand for every week that you go out to collect. Maybe a little more than that if you're confident that you're the only human and that the animals who depend on those will also be fed. Robin Wall Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass reminds us that the ethical harvest requires us to take only what we need and to use everything that we take. So, but the delicious summer fruits. Agarita, one of the early fruits, is best harvested by putting a sheet under the plant and then hitting the stems with a stick so that you can keep a distance from those prickly leaves. My favorite preparation for the Agarita berries is to puree them and strain out the seeds, and then you're left with the pulp that can be added to all kinds of drinks. Prickly pear there on the upper right is of course one that requires a little more preparation because of the glochids. You need to either peel the tuna or hold it in a tongs over a flame until you roast the glochids off. And the other cactus fruits I know of require that same treatment. Hackberry fruits there in the upper right can be ground in a paste in the mortar and pestle so that you get the benefits of the calcium in those really tough seeds. Phil Daring, another archaeologist, says that condalia, also known as Brazil or bluewood down there on the lower right, is a vastly underrated fruit. And I've eaten it a few times. It doesn't appeal quite so much to me, but I'm one who likes the Texas persimmon, and that's not always something that folks like. During drought years in Austin, I've had good success placing grapes on a screen outdoors and covering it with a light cloth. And it takes a week or so, but the raisins are absolutely delicious. Larger fruits, or even things like huckleberries can be seeded and pureed and then dried into fruit leather. And we know that that's a historic tradition of longstanding because Spanish missionaries were gifted persimmon leather by Caddo Indians in East Texas. I should say my persimmon here on the lower right isn't ripe, and neither is the elderberry right next to it, but they will get there. And for the fall resources, there are 6 or 7 species of sumac in Texas, depending on how you count them. These 4 have fruits that are less hairy than the others, so I find them a little more palatable. Sumac lemonade is easy and delicious, and I want to thank Neil Stilley for sending me these fruits from East Texas that I was able to make this with. Some people add sweeteners, agave syrup, sugar, whatever makes you happy. Sumac is in the same family as cashews and poison ivy and mango. I haven't heard of anyone reacting to sumac, but I'm terribly allergic to poison ivy, and I don't have trouble with anything else in the family. But please do be cautious with sumac if you are allergic. Start slowly. There's also a nice In Defense of Plants podcast episode on the Anacardiaceae, the sumac family that I recommend. And there's also a crossover episode with this podcast Will Kill You on poison ivy and how it is a T-cell mediated immune response, which is really interesting. Sumac berries are powdered and widely used in Middle Eastern cuisine, especially in a spice mix called za'atar. And this is a basic recipe for it: 1 part each of the ground sumac berries, ground thyme, and toasted sesame seeds. The mixture that I made there on the left, I did not toast the sesame seeds, and I regret that. I also used a full part of cumin to add to the other 3 ingredients, and that was a little much, but I'd be interested. But if you really like cumin, go for it. And as with any traditional spice mixes like moles, there are a wide variety of variations, and some of them are secret. My favorite use of the za'atar mix is on roasted sweet potatoes. It's just really lovely. Other people use it as a meat rub or sprinkle it on oiled flatbread. And while we're still in the fall, I will do some nuts, these acorns that are more starchy and a little less oily than the hickory nuts, but they are more oily than grains like corn. And it's important to have a good helper, and you see mine in the background. he kept me on task, I guess. And what you have in these boxes, in the back box that the cat is smelling, those are bur oak acorns, Quercus macrocarpa, and in the front are some red oak acorns. I do not know exactly which species is growing in my front yard, so I have collected those, and even being careful to look for for acorns that have a little hole in them that show a worm exiting or entering. You'll really save yourself a lot of time and trouble if you put them into a bucket of water and discard any of the ones that float. That will really help. Oh, and I should warn you here, there's no recipe for this. I have not had enough success with acorn flour to provide something I feel is a definitive recipe. This is purely sharing the experience, and I would love to hear yours in the chat. There are so many ways for acorns to go bad, and you don't discover them until you have pounded them once, cracked them in the mortar and pestle, and then they're moldy, or there's a bad spot, or there's a worm, and you just have to have the discipline to put those aside. They go to the compost so that they don't wreck your whole batch of flour. These are some shelled acorns. The bur oak white acorns are in the back, and the red oaks are in the front. Notice that I have not peeled off the testa, that sort of inner shell, inner seed coat. That turned out to be a big mistake the first time that I tried acorn processing. In that case, I did a hot leaching method to get rid of the tannins in the acorns, the mouth-drying things that will cause stomach upset and all kinds of things if you eat them. I did 8 changes of water. It took all afternoon, and the nuts were still bitter. I did roast them, put a little olive oil and salt on them, and they were quite nice, a lot like corn nuts, but they were also still bitter, and that's because I did not get rid of the testa, I'm pretty sure. So the next year that I tried these, I did cold soaking with the water changed every day, a very slow process. At 10 days, I gave up and put in baking soda. I had been testing them with acid paper every day. And interestingly, no difference between the white and the red oak acorns according to my paper, to my acid test paper. And at 10 days, I put in some baking soda, and that cleared things up. So I cheated, but I got there. And the way this time to grind to get to the acorn flour, at this point I added more clean water, put it in the blender, pureed it, and you can see to the right that I very carefully took the testa off those red oak acorns, and did have a success. Just squeeze them out in probably actually a pillowcase rather than a towel, and then opened that out to dry. So a good success. You can find acorn cornbread recipes on the internet, but it usually involves a mixture of all-purpose flour and acorn flour, and then use that mixture in a cornmeal cornbread recipe. We'll get you an acorn recipe. So please let me know if you've had some good successes with acorn flour. I would be really interested to hear what worked for you. So, food for hard times is something that people in the past have needed often, but there's some upsides. That food for hard times can also be very festive foods, and the particular kinds of food I'm looking at here are geophytes, underground storage organs like bulbs, tubers, corms, rhizomes. They're places where plants store their energy, and that energy can be available to humans with sufficient know-how and determination. And the harvest can be beneficial for the plant communities as well. Say, an overgrown camas stand that humans come in, dig out the bulbs, remove competitor plants, weeds, and take out the large bulbs for human consumption and leave the small bulbs to grow, and they'll grow vigorously in this newly turned soil. So for humans, long, slow cooking of geophytes caramelizes the onions. Sometimes it carbonizes them, caramelizes the onions and turns the compounds like inulins that are in camas into simpler carbohydrates that people can digest. And the labor inputs in this sort of earth oven cooking, where you are looking at a lot of digging, a lot of rocks, a lot of firewood, these are really considerable labor inputs. So it's really best done by groups. It is not something I've personally done in my backyard, but I'm fortunate to know people in the anthropology clubs at Texas A&M, at Texas State, and so on, who've made earth ovens as a group activity, a weekend group activity, because this is a 36 to 72 hour cooking process before, this is after you've, doesn't even count the digging labor. So the photos that I will show are of an earth oven feast at the Shumla School in Comstock, as photographed by Almastad Park Ranger Jack Johnson, and I thank him for these lovely photos. So you start by digging a pit. and collecting firewood and rocks of a particular size. And the rocks collapse nicely into the coals if you are experienced enough to know where to put these rocks, which the folks at Shimla are after all these years. And so at the point that the wood starts collapsing and the rocks are hot and the coals are there, you add packing material, in this case prickly pads down in the lower right photo, to protect the food from the fire and to add moisture to the system. And then you put in the food. In this case, these are sotol hearts and lechuguilla hearts. The outer leaves have been cut off. And you can see that the sotol leaves are added for additional packing material on top of the hearts. And then the pit, lower right, is covered with earth. So the pit does need to be checked on frequently to patch up places where the steam is escaping, or things will be underdone, or alternatively, sometimes they can get dried out and then start to burn, to carbonize. So 72 hours later, 36 to 72, depending on what you're cooking, the earth oven is opened and the cooked sotol and lechuguilla hearts are ready, and they're good. And I have tried those, and sotol is typically sweeter than lechuguilla, but there's a wide range of sweetness in lechuguilla, which raises questions, I think, about whether ancestors of some of these lechuguilla populations were cultivated by people selected for sweetness in the long past. And the tribal historic preservation officer from Mescalero Apache once gave me some cooked agaves, the larger and the sweeter agaves from southern New Mexico that also grow in far west Texas. And they are wonderful, beautiful, moist, and very sweet. She was Holly Houghton. She was diplomatic, but she was also pretty clear that her people really didn't have a lot of use for the lechuguilla out here in central Texas, as it's smaller and less sweet than the agaves that she's used to. And there is a literature on the chemistry of earth oven cooking, the transformation of inulins into simple carbohydrates, for instance. And this one Schneider article, 1997, is a good place to start. Phil Deering, archaeologist, has calculated the calories per hour, the return rates, for various kinds of West Texas foods. You see the lechuguilla there, second from the bottom. In defense of plants, I do want to point out that these are post-encounter return rates. It's from the time that you've been able to put your hand on the lechuguilla. And I do want to point out that in West Texas, it's a lot easier to put your hand on a lechuguilla than to put your hand on a deer. So I'd be interested to know what the, from the time you go looking, return rate would really be. So the kinds of foods that are cooked in earth ovens do range across Texas historically. Of course, West Texas, the sotol, the lechuguilla, and the other agaves if you're out in very far West Texas. And in central Texas, bulbs and tubers, also corms, Leotris and erythronium in central Texas. I will point out that my Indian breadroot, that pediomelum down on the bottom right, is latistipulatum. It is one that has a woodier root, so probably not a species of Indian breadroot that would have been widely used, but it is an example of the type of plant. And in East Texas, you not only see the bulbs, but also aquatic species being cooked in these earth ovens. Wapato, traditional also in the Pacific Northwest. Pond lily, there are accounts from, it's probably LaSalle's nephew in the Great Lakes area of what are probably pond lily underground organs being cooked in very large pits in the Great Lakes area. So. And in these days of legal cannabis, I should maybe apologize to anybody who showed up with a different idea of what a talk about native edibles might be. But thank you, if you're still with us, thank you for sticking with it. I won't be talking about these except just a couple of notes. First, of course, the peyote is threatened, and please leave it to grow in peace. If you see it, weed around it, bless the plant, and move on. For the datura, upper left there, a quick Google on datura poisoning should discourage casual use of that plant. The poppies, upper right, photo taken there in the Franklin Franklin Mountains in El Paso. I do know it's illegal to grow heroin poppies with the intention of making heroin. I don't know if it's okay to grow prickly poppies or cow pops with the intention of making a sedative tea. But I do encourage you to go visit the archaeology museum. Oh, so sorry. The archaeology museum in El Paso, where I took that photo. There's some lovely native plants on the grounds, although there are no prickly poppies this year. The weather event seems to have hit them really hard. As to the native tobaccos, if you're going to smoke a native tobacco, and I haven't and would love to know from people who have, I would stick to the Nicotiana obtusifolia, lower left, also called desert tobacco, I believe, rather than the fiddle leaf tobacco, lower right, Nicotiana repanda of central Texas. The fiddle leaf tobacco doesn't have much in the way of nicotine, and I don't think was much used in ancient times, as opposed to the obtusifolia that has a much longer tradition. I will close out with a couple of recipes that affect the mind. This vodka infusion is based on a recipe from Lauren Peterson of White Deer Apothecary here on the west side of Austin. And the use of native plants to make that recipe was inspired by Waterloo's use of yopon leaves in one of their gins. Here is, and it doesn't have to be an alcohol experience. You could also infuse this into honey or into glycerin for an herbal sweetener that would absolutely taste of Texas. And here's mine after about 36 hours. For me, I count that as halfway infused, though some people might want to start straining at this point. The juniper was quite strong at that point, quite nice really though. And the bent straw flavor was surprisingly strong. By the 36-hour point when I took things out, the bed straw had kind of mellowed out, or the other flavors had come more forward. The sumac didn't give the bright sour or citrus taste that I was really hoping for. So my recipe is still missing an element of this, of a well-rounded gin. And I would really, again, I would appreciate any suggestions as to what might work. Although it may simply have been that I'm using evergreen sumac, and my seeds were, or my fruits were about a year and a half old at that point. So possibly it's not the recipe, it's my particular ingredients, but please let me know. Oh, here's what mine looks like right now after it's been strained. It's just a nice pale gold, but again, not the clear that you see in so many commercial gins. So, and many of us probably have a recipe for yopon tea, but just in case, we'll end with one of those. Here's my recipe. I have used leaves from yopon volunteers in my yard, and I've also used leaves from cultivated dwarf yopon. And I quite like the dwarf yopon because the leaves, well, they fit into an infuser without crushing them, and I really like the look of the whole leaves, just because you get the shiny top side and the matte bottom side, and you can leave the leaves whole. And I like the reminder of where our food comes from. So I'm kind of a fan of the dwarf yopons for this. And I tend to infuse the tea when I'm just making a cup for myself, and I simmer it in a large pot for 30 minutes when I'm making tea for a crowd. So I think that's all I have. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me know your thoughts.
I'd like to ask you a question about how often do you, I'm sure your diet does not consist entirely of any of these recipes or these ingredients, but how often do you use them?
Ooh. Sometimes it's driven by necessity. We eat salad here every day, and if we're out of salad, I just go out back and take what's there. And I have naturalized violets and dandelions, and so it's really easy to come up with wild greens from my 0.2 acre lot. I don't really eat anything except the greens regularly, and of course there's just so much labor involved that being a gatherer is a full-time job. So and another constraint is Wonder Bread was invented for a reason. Wild plants have a lot of bitter compounds. They're trying to get predators not to eat them. So we're trying to get rid of the bitter to develop the sweet, to get rid of the fiber, are what humans are doing. And I'm sure it will be lovely probably good for our health to have more of those bitter compounds and fiber. But I think there is a point where our bodies do rebel. So
Yes.
yeah, does that answer your question? Have you tried wild foods?
I have tried a few very little wild foods. I went to a restaurant once where they were serving the Yopon tea, and
Mm-hmm.
I actually thought it was pretty good. And
Yes, and I see
I
Peter
haven't.
Shar has asked about Yopon tea versus South American mate, and I would have that, which is Ilex paraguariensis, I believe. Um, I have to say I much prefer our native, but the mate that I've had is from tea bags that have been factorized and shipped from South America and then set on the shelves. So I would love to I should maybe write a research grant that I need that experience of going to South America and trying it right out of the pot. Uh, oh, the other question that I see, and I apologize if I haven't gotten to everybody's, but just one that hit me. Robert Camper on Mustang Grape Wine. Um, my dad made Concord grape wine in Kentucky when I was growing up. I'm told it was quite rough. But that said, Crystal Dozier, who was a grad student at Texas A&M and is now, I believe, she's at a university in Kansas, and I apologize to her, I don't remember. She has an article out where she has looked at chemical residues on potsherds from Central Texas and found evidence that she believes is of ancient grape wine in Central Texas. It's the archaeologists call it late prehistoric, and that's a terrible name, and I'm really sorry. But sometime within the last 1,000 years, but before Columbus, people probably making grape wine or doing something that leaves the residues of grape wine on potsherds. So really cool.
Interesting. The you referred to some books earlier that had
Yes.
recipes in it. Can you tell us about those or show them to us or?
Oh, I can bring the screen back up, and while I'm doing that, I will tell Barbara that you can buy that gin from Waterloo, and I did. I believe that the Waterloo folks weren't they at one of the NIPSOT meeting on the south side of San Antonio?
Hmm.
Uh, was that 2016?
Probably. I just remember the locations, not the years. So
Yeah.
here's the slide. Ian Thompson, Choctaw Foods, is the one who he's the most archaeological in that he's trying to recreate ancient traditions, and as you see, he's using earthen pots on a tripod over a fire, which is not what I'm too lazy to do that.
Yeah, that's a little
And that's what
extreme.
he does. Yeah. And then the two YouTube channels. Tanya Bryant, who YouTubes under Mohawk Chef, and Nico Albert. I think she is Cherokee and video. Oh, so sorry. And videos under her own name, Nico Albert. The sous chef. I believe he's been on. A lot of cooking shows. He also has a restaurant in Minneapolis, and I was able to visit a native garden. Associated that one of the Lakota tribes runs in the Minneapolis suburbs. Just fascinating.
Oh.
And Spirit of the Harvest has some wonderful dishes. I haven't cooked out of Lois Frank's book, so I can't talk about that. But it got a Beard Award, so probably good. So, and anything in particular on those?
Look great.
Yeah.
And Caddo Mound's a state historic site, often when we're not in pandemic, often brings Caddo essentially visiting scholars, including Cricket Rhodes Conawerty came one time and cooked traditional Caddo dishes in their guest house, including grape dumplings. That was just really lovely.
Oh, the good, because that was going to be one thing that I was going to ask you is like where we could go to if we didn't want to prepare these ourselves, but we just wanted to sample.
Yeah, there are several tribes in Texas still, in Alabama, Coshada, Cherokees, a lot of folks who maybe weren't here historically, but have been for the past few hundred years. And we need more native restaurants, I think.
Yeah, we do. Oh, can you tell us what Archaeobotany Academy is?
Oh, thank you. Yes, that is a weekend workshop that we run really only about every 4 years with the Texas Archaeological Society. They run the intro to archaeology is every year and ceramics is every year and so on. And this year, because it's a virtual event, we're trying to make lemons from lemonade, and having 2 members of Caddo Nation are going to come Zoom in for us. And Elder Phil Cross, who led the grass house building effort at Caddo Mounds a few years ago, he's going to come in and talk about traditional canoe making, I assume from bald cypress, these huge bald cypress logs. And he's made those for museum displays in the past. Elena Talate is going to come and talk about Caddo language. She teaches the Caddo language class and is going to come talk about Caddo language for plants and Caddo gardening. I'll be talking a lot about archaeobotany, and we have a couple other archaeologists coming in to talk about archaeology and botany in East Texas. And Liz Horton is coming in from Virginia, zooming in from Virginia.
Wow.
She is a fiber plant expert and has found some really interesting findings on mesh size of the bags versus crops versus and some fiber plants that were used but were no longer used by 1492. So they were really unknown, except for the fact that there are these bags that were preserved in caves in the Ozark Mountains. And she's just fascinating. She does a lot of dye work and weaving herself. So you could txarch.org. Texarch.org is the Texas Archaeological Society website. You can find us under the academies. Thanks for
Can you say that? You bet. Can you say that a little slower? So
Sure. Okay. TXARCH, short for Texas Archaeology .org.
Okay.
And there's an activities menu at the top and academies. It'll be activities, academies, archaeobotany, and it's April 24th and 25th this weekend. We're hoping, the weekend of April 24th and 25th, we're hoping to have a reunion, an in-person reunion at maybe the Fort Worth Botanical Gardens or possibly the Wildflower Center, where we can all get together after that weekend and see each other in person and see some plants in person.
Right. Okay. Maybe we'll all have shots by then, but we can still wear masks and far apart.
Yes. Amen. Yes, I will. Oh, here, stop share. There we go.
Yeah.
And
What an interesting topic. So, well, I'll have to go. That the virtual event is the 24th and 25th. Then.
24th and 25th with an equipment check-in on the night of the 23rd.
Okay.
So, yes, which things have gone so beautifully today. Congratulations. Well, I don't want to jinx anything, but congratulations so far. Yeah.
Well, there's always something, but
Yeah.
I did want to remind people that if you got the Dropbox link when you registered, that there is one of the things that is in there is a list of recipes that Dr. Bush has offered us. So be sure, and if you're interested in those, then go there and find it. Thanks.
Right. We can. Yes, that's great. Everyone should have gotten that in one of Meg's emails, I think.
Maybe
please.
Could we put the link in the chat again, maybe just in case, for the Dropbox?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well,
And please let me know how things turn out for you, for things that you make. So,
you know what, Bill? I'm not sure I can go to the Dropbox and do that while we're on. Maybe Meg could do that.
Yeah.
If that doesn't work, we can always send an email out to all the participants with the Dropbox link.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
This is so fascinating. You make me want to go out and dig a pit. And I have so much lechuguilla in my front yard that has kind of taken over. Because I had one, it grew, it's the stalk flowered, then it died. And then I thought, oh, well, that's that. And then like 5 years later, now I have an army of them.
Oh, yes.
So I thought, well, I just need to eat them. So I don't know how big they need to be to eat. I mean, the leaves are about
they're not very big, or most of them aren't very big, especially in the West Texas wild, but you might try them I have not tried the crock, because this is obviously crock pot cooking. You just leave the lid on. So you might try them in your crock pot.
Okay, so I don't have to dig a pit. Great.
Oh, or get a bunch of friends. It's a feasting occasion. Get a bunch of friends over and everybody mostly stays up for 2 nights and checks on the fire.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah, have fun. Yay.
Okay. Well, how interesting. Thank you so much for
Oh,
coming.
sure. Yeah, thanks
Yes.
for having me.
Thank you. Yes.